Hi. So, my name is Phil Wilkins. I'm a programmer at Sony Santa Monica, and I'm here today to talk to you about the camera system for God of War. Now, we're a character-driven third-person action-adventure game with no camera controls, which makes the camera one of the most important and complicated actors in the game, second only to Kratos himself. So when it came to designing the camera system, we had a few objectives. It should be flexible enough to allow a designer to produce any shot they wanted. We wanted the game to be a cinematic experience. The player should feel like they're taking part in a great action movie. And to do that, we needed to empower the designers to realise their vision. The camera motions should all be as smooth as possible, unless the designer requires otherwise. The player should not need to control the camera. This one worked out so well that we actually ended up removing camera control completely. There should be no collision with the environment, by which I mean that it's up to the designer to constrain the camera such that it doesn't go through walls. Whenever I've tried resolving camera collision with the environment in the past, it's always introduced pops, or it gets hung up on the geometry. Collision geometry is generally designed to constrain the player and not the camera. So let's break the system down. In zoning, we'll deal with the use of a spatial database to select cameras. Dynamics is where we'll calculate a single dynamic camera. Blending, where we'll smooth the transitions out between cameras. Rails will cover constraining the camera to a path. And in fields, I'll present a more advanced way of controlling blending. These subsystems are in rough order of development, although obviously there was some overlap. It's also a large and complicated system, so I'm only going to cover the basics. So let's start with zoning. Back when real-time 3D rendering was really expensive, we would use stationary cameras so that we could use offline rendering techniques to produce high-quality backdrops that we could then integrate into a real-time character into. The current camera would be chosen based on the player's position in the room, which would allow you to examine different areas by walking up to them. The first game I saw like this was Alone in the Dark back in 1992, and there have been many more since then. Resident Evil is probably the most famous example, and it was still using this system as recently as Resident Evil 0 in 2002. So, we're going to need to turn the player's position into a camera. The game has a spatial database of zones, each referencing one or more cameras, although for the moment we'll just deal with the case where a single zone references a single camera. Those green rectangles on the right are our zones. To the left you can see the cameras. The solid black one is our current camera, and the white one is currently inactive. The letters indicate the references. The top zone referencing camera A, so for simplicity's sake we'll be calling it Zone A, and the bottom one, Zone B, references camera B. The player, that's the little stick figure in Zone A, the player is in Zone A, so camera A is active. Sometimes I refer to the player as the target. For this talk, they're effectively interchangeable. So when the player moves into a zone that references a camera that isn't the currently active one, we activate that camera. That was important, so I'll repeat it. When the player moves into a zone that references a camera that isn't the currently active one, we activate that camera. This allows us to loosen up the boundaries between cameras, to add a little bit of hysteresis into our system by playing with the boundaries of the zones. So, for example, if we leave a space for them, a space between them, then we use the camera that we entered that space with, like that. And only when we enter the new zone does the new camera start. So we re-enter that zone where previously we were using camera A in it, now we'll be using camera B, and we won't switch back to camera A until we cross into Zone A. Alternatively, we can overlap the zones, in which case, when we enter the overlap space, we always change to the new camera, like that. And when we enter on the other direction, we'll switch straight back to camera A. Okay, so how do we go about implementing that? Well, first we need to build our cameras and our zones, and for this we use Maya. Actually, for pretty much everything that involves creating stuff in 3 dimensions, we use Maya. This is what a camera designer typically sees. That green region on the right is a camera zone. To the left of it, you can see a couple of cameras. And to the right is the attribute editor for the camera. It's just a normal Maya camera that we've added dynamic attributes to that our tools will then import into the engine. So here we are again, little stick figure on the left, 3 zones, A, B and C for cameras A, B and C. So at runtime, each frame we query the spatial database of zones and we get back a collection of camera references. Since we don't want to make too many assumptions about the zone database, we effectively treat them as unsorted. So here, in the overlap between A and C, we get cameras A and C back from the query. In the overlap between all 3, we'll get all 3 back. As we move through the spaces. So a naive implementation would just compare the results from the query against the currently active camera. And if there's a difference, swap to the new camera. This works fine unless your zones overlap. So in this example, when we move from zone A into the overlap between zones A and C, we start off right by switching to camera C. But next frame, we're still in the overlap, still getting A and C back from the query, but now C is the active camera, and A looks like it's new, so we swap to A. Until next frame, well, you get the idea. We're going to alternate between the two, which isn't really what we want. So to fix this, we need to remember the cameras that were submitted last frame. We do this by storing them in a list we call the submission list, pushing new cameras on the top, and using the top of the list to decide which camera to use. This results in a list sorted by how recently a camera was returned from the query. It's effectively sorted by age. So how does this work? Well, here we go again, our little 3 zones on the top left, little player in them. Just in the middle there we have the results from the query. And on the right we have the submission list with the top entry marked in red. So, camera A is not currently in the submission list, so we'll add it. The top item in the submission list has changed, so we'll switch to that camera. Next frame, we move into the overlap between A and C. We get A and C back from the query. Now, camera A is already in the submission list, but camera C isn't. So we add it to the top of the list. The top entry has changed, so we'll start that camera, camera C. Now we move into the overlap between all 3 zones, and we get all 3 zones back from the query. Camera B wasn't in the submission list, so we insert it at the top, and the top entry in the submission list has changed, so we start camera B. Next we move out of zone A. Zone A drops out of the query, so we remove zone A from the submission list, but the top of the submission list hasn't changed, so we don't bother changing the camera. Finally, we move out of zone B. Zone B is now no longer in the submission list, so it's no longer in the query, so we remove it from the submission list. And as a result of this, the camera at the top of the submission list has changed. So we start camera C. There you go. Well, sometimes you just want one camera to always override another. Maybe it simplifies your zoning, or maybe you've got another system that turns zones on and off. We deal with this by adding a priority to the camera, higher priorities, and for us this means larger priority values always override lower ones. So in this example, we'll see that whenever the player is in zone B, camera B will be active, even though in the previous example we would have swapped back into camera A. Camera B overrides it when they're both being submitted because it has a higher priority. And only when we move out of zone B does camera A become active. So here's our previous example, only this time we've added priorities to the camera. Cameras A and B are higher priority than camera C. So camera A goes into the submission list, blah, 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 start camera A, move into the overlap between cameras A and C. C turns up in the query result, but this time, because C is a lower priority than A, we'll be inserting it below A in the submission list. And because the top of the submission list hasn't changed, we won't be changing camera. Next row, we move into the overlap between A, B, and C. B appears in the query. B is not in the submission list, so we'll insert it into the submission list. Now it's the same priority as A, so we'll end up, but it's newer, so we'll end up inserting it above. And the top entry in the submission list has changed, and so we start camera B. Now we move out of camera zone A. Blah, blah. Camera A goes out to the submission list doesn't change. Don't change camera. Move into zone C. Finally, we've moved out. We've removed zone B from the submission list, and so we can start camera C. So you see, camera C only started when we're in its zone alone and not in zones A or B. So to recap, the submission list contains the current set of cameras up for consideration. We insert and delete entries to match the current query results, assuming we got any. If the query was entry, then we hold the previous frame's submissions. This doesn't really make much difference. The submission list is sorted by priority, then by age, or rather by how recently the camera was submitted, which results in the newest, highest priority camera sitting at the top of the list, and this will be our active camera. So that's the basics of zoning. We now actually have enough to implement camera systems from things like Alone in the Dark, Ecstatica, Grim Fandango, and the first game I worked on, Alien Odyssey. However, rendering power has improved a bit since the early 90s. Now we can render pretty high-quality backdrops in real time, giving us the freedom to move the camera, which is where dynamics comes in. So when we talk about dynamics, we're really talking about moving and orienting the camera to control certain display characteristics of the player. The player's position on screen, the angle that we're looking at them from, and their size, which is a function of their distance from the camera and the field of view. So in order to control the player's position on the screen, we define an area of it within which it is safe for him to move. Safe for him to move without having to move the camera to keep him in that zone. We define a rectangular space on the screen known as the safe zone. And if we want the player to always be at a particular position, we can shrink that safe zone down into the point. This safe zone is represented to the designer as a pair of resolution-independent coordinates, as you can see in my lovely sketch, down to the bottom and the right. And at runtime, we overlay this safe zone on the real-time display. So we get a little rectangle framing the player. This allows us to put the player down in the bottom right of the screen, revealing the action and excitement happening in the background off to the top left. So first we're going to calculate next we're going to calculate the angle that we're going to view the player at. We can specify that angle that we're viewing the player from as a fixed value, in which case we use the orientation of the camera in Maya to define that value. Slightly more interesting is to calculate it relative to a fixed position in space. Now, because each dynamic camera is still defined by a camera in Maya, we already have a convenient fixed position, that of the camera node in Maya. So we do our calculations relative to that. We can also constrain it to within a fixed range. And to specify that range, we use the orientation of the camera node in Maya, plus or minus a fixed amount defined in one of those dynamic attributes we added to the camera. Finally, we control the size of the player on the screen by controlling his distance to it. The simplest way of specifying this is just to set it to a fixed value. Or we can specify it as a proportion of the distance from the camera node to the player. So here it's halfway between the node in Maya and the player's current position. And we can define negative values, in which case we automatically turn the camera around to look back at the player. Finally, we allow the designer to set a range of valid distances for the camera, ensuring that it never gets too far from or too close to the player. And similarly to the safe zone, we can collapse these constraints to represent a fixed distance. So that's how we let the designer control the three defining properties of the camera: the position of the player, the angle we're looking at him from, or rather the orientation of the camera, and his size, or rather the distance from the camera to the plane of the target perpendicular to the look vector. Internally, we calculate and constrain and store these as the angle from the look vector of the camera to the target. Now, this is a 2D diagram, but in 3D, this is actually going to be a pair of angles from the horizontal and vertical in camera space. We use angles so that we can easily represent the cases where the target is behind the camera. It also makes it easier to apply the safe zone constraints, as these are internally represented as a pair of angular ranges in the same space. So the orientation of the camera is represented as the angle of the camera to the world. Again, this is a 2D diagram, so consider that dotted line to be 0 degrees. In 3D, we use an Euler because they're easy to manipulate and visualize. And finally, we represent the size as the distance to the target plane. We package all of these up with the position of the target, and we now have enough information to calculate the actual position and orientation of the camera in the world. So it's a very simple algorithm. We calculate the angle from the camera to the target, and then we constrain it. We calculate the angle from the camera to the world, and then we constrain that. And then we calculate the distance from the camera to the target plane and constrain that. So already we can choose between a number of dynamically calculated cameras, and we have a fairly powerful system to start with. So, blending. The trouble with the system described so far is that every time we change camera, we get a visual cut. The shot jumps from one position to another, which is distracting for the player, and if your controls are camera relative, adds an extra layer of complexity to the control system to cope with it. Rather than cut from position to position, we can instead blend from one camera to the next. This can maintain the illusion of a single dynamic camera, while allowing us to construct it from many simpler ones, which allows us to continue a single shot for as long as our designer requires. I'm going to break blending down into 3 separate topics. Timers, which track and update each blend. Ease, which controls the smoothness of a blend. And blend space, where I'll define what a blend between 2 cameras actually does. So, when we start a new camera, we don't cut to it, but instead blend to it over a fixed period of time. And when I say blend, I mean we effectively create a third camera from varying proportions of 2 other cameras. So when we start the second camera, what actually happens, I'll show you that again, is that a phantom third camera moves from the first camera to the second, its position and orientation determined by a blend of the 2 cameras driven by a timer. When we move into a zone that references a new camera, as well as starting that new camera, we'll also start a timer for it. Now, if the player is moving between zones faster than their cameras fade in, then it's entirely possible that we'll be running multiple timers simultaneously. So we're going to need to store these in the list. In fact, you may be fading back into a camera you're already fading out of. The player moves backwards and forwards between 2 zones quickly. In these cases, you may be tempted to try and reverse a running timer. I initially tried this, but I couldn't get it to work very smoothly, as you need to correct all the timers between the 2 instances. Instead, I decided it was much simpler to let each timer play out and to track new timers separately. New cameras fade in, and by fading in, reduce the contribution of the cameras below them in the list. So cameras don't fade out by themselves, they fade out as a result of a new camera fading in. The timer list is a FIFO, first in, first out. New timers get inserted at the top, and timers below completed timers fall out at the bottom. So let's have a look at how that works. Here we have the same example from before. We'll forget about the query results, and now we'll just look at the submission list and how it controls the timer list. Now, the red bar at the top of both lists, this is because the top of the submission list and the top of the timer list should be the same camera. This is the active camera, the camera that we would cut to if we weren't fading it in. So we're in Zone A. Zone A turns up at the top of the submission list, and we start a new timer. The timer list is empty, so it starts immediately. You can see just in the little timer list entry there, the 1/1 is meant to represent we're 1 unit of time, shall we say seconds, into a timer that is supposed to last all of 1 second. So we start camera A. So move into Zone C. Zone C turns up at the top of the submission list. We start a new timer for it at the top of the timer list. And it's a timer that's going to take 3 seconds to complete. We're already 1 second into it. And the camera now becomes a blend of cameras A and C, indicated here by turning the black cameras grey. So we'll move into Zone B. Zone B appears at the top of the submission list. We update the timers in our timer list. Zone C is now 2 seconds into 3. We don't bother updating timers that have completed. Start new timers. B comes in, already 1 second in. It's going to take 4 seconds to complete. And the camera is now a blend of all three. Move out of Zone A. Zone A drops out of the submission list. Doesn't really make any difference. The top of the camera hasn't changed. Update timers. And we can now see that the timer for camera C has completed. So we'll be removing the entry for camera A, and the camera is now only a blend of cameras B and C. Move out of Zone B, which effectively puts Zone C at the top of the submission, camera C at the top of the submission list. Update timers, and we'll insert a new timer for for camera C. As you'll see here, we've got a situation where camera C appears in the timer list twice because camera B is still fading it out, and we just re-entered it, so we're starting to fade it back in again. Hang around, update the timers. B has finished fading in, so we drop the second instance of C out. Update the timers again. Eventually, our single camera has faded all the way in. We've moved B, and we're now just using camera C. So that's how we maintain the timer list, but how does this affect the actual blend of cameras that we want? Well, let's look at one of these blends in detail. In this case, we have the one with the 2 entries for camera C, because we moved out of its zone and back into it. We start with the oldest camera and blend the next one in using camera B's timer to define the proportion of camera B to use. So in this case, it's 3 seconds in out of a total of 4. So that's 3/4 of camera B and leaving 1/4 of camera C. Next, we take the result and blend that with our next newest camera, the top camera, camera C, using the new camera's timer. It's 1 second in out of 3, so 1/3 of the new camera C and 2/3 of the previous blend, which handily works out to be half of camera B and half of camera C. The trouble with using these timers raw is that you get these very simple linear blends. You can see the sharp corners, and when you use them to blend cameras, you can see the jerk as it starts to move and again when it stops. Now, while sometimes this is desirable, most of the time it's just ugly. So what we want to do is add what animators call ease, and to do this we feed the linear blend into a spline. Specifically a Hermite spline, which lets you control the position and tangents of the endpoints of the curve. we fix the endpoints at 0 and 1 and map the tangents into a range that makes sense as an ease control. We end up with 1 representing a full ease, 0 no ease or linear, and we give them the option of setting a negative ease for those special times when you need a really harsh transition. And we allow the designer to control the ease in and out of a transition separately. We apply ease when we calculate the blend factor between two cameras. We take the timer and we feed it into an ease function, which just evaluates the Hermite, taking the ease in and out values from the new camera. So we have a pair of cameras to blend between, and we have a blend factor. Well, what does that blend actually involve? Well, the simplest blend would be to linearly interpolate position and rotation of the two cameras. So here we have our two cameras, the plan view on the left, and on the right we can see what the resulting camera will actually see. The problem with interpolating directly is that this causes the player to throb visibly during the transition. You can see here on the right, the player visibly grows as we approach the halfway point and then shrinks back to normal. This isn't really desirable, so instead what we do here is to take this circular path, which leaves the player at a constant size during the blend. In fact, what we do is blend the values we calculated during the dynamics phase, the position, size and orientation of the player in screen space, represented by the angle to the world, the angle to the target, and the distance to the target plane. This means that whenever we blend between two cameras, the player moves smoothly from his position, size and orientation in one camera to his position, size and orientation in the other. And that's the basics of blending. And with the system we've described so far, you can make ICO. Indeed, ICO was my primary inspiration for the design up until this point, although I have to say I have no idea if this is actually what they're doing. We actually made nearly half of God of War with just this system. The big problem with it is that it's quite difficult to control the camera in tight spaces, like moving the camera through corridors or up staircases. So in order to deal with this, we borrow an idea from the film industry. One of their solutions to this problem is to construct rails and put the camera on a little cart known as a dolly that rides on the rails. I know it should be track, but that's such an overloaded word that I set it on rails in an attempt at clarity. Now, for us, the rail is a spline, specifically a NURB constructed in Maya, and the dolly is a point on that spline represented by the parametric value of the spline at that point. So, we have a rail, we have a dolly on that rail, and we have the camera sitting on the dolly. What we want to do is only move the dolly by enough to keep the player within the constraints defined by the camera, represented by these dotted lines. So the player is free to remove within the constraints. When he tries to move outside of them, the dolly moves to compensate as best it can. So how do we do that? Well, remember that the dolly is actually just a point on the spline represented by a single parameter. We use the constraints to calculate a weight at any given point on this spline. Here we can see that the player is 2 units outside of the constraint, so the value of the weighting function at this point, 0, is 2. If we move the dolly to position 1, the player will become just inside the constraint, and so the weight at this position is 0. Between positions 1 and 2, the value remains 0, as the player remains inside both constraints. And as we move to position 3, the player is now 2 units outside the other constraint, and the weight is 2 again. So armed with this weighting function, what we're really trying to do is to find the nearest minima on it to the previous position of the dolly. So, in this example, we start off inside the constraints, but the player moves outside of them, which gives us a weighting graph that looks like this. Now, in order to help us find the nearest minima, we add the distance from the dolly's initial position to the weighting function, which gives us a set of weights that looks like this. Now, there are a number of ways to locate the minima, but this is how we do it. We take a guess as to which direction the player has moved and take an experimental step in that direction. If the weight at the new position is lower than the previous weight, then we try another step. If the resulting weight is higher, then we turn around, slow down, and go back. Again, we've gone downhill here, so we're going to have another go at going forwards. And now we've gone uphill a little bit, so we're going to turn around, slow down, and go back again. And ultimately, after doing this for a number of times, we'll be hopefully fairly near the minima. And we decide that when we've moved less than a certain distance, our threshold, then we stop. The smaller the threshold you set, the smaller the potential error, and the smoother the camera will be. But also, the more times you'll evaluate the weighting function. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. So to summarise, we start by adding the distance from the previous frame's dolly position to the weighting function. We then guess the first move based on how far and in which direction we moved last frame. If the weight at the new position decreases, we keep going. Otherwise, we slow down and turn around and repeat these two stages until we've moved less than our threshold value. It's important to calculate this threshold in world space, as the distance between 2 points on the rail, as the correlation between the amount the dolly parameter changes and the physical distance it moves depends entirely on how the rail was constructed and will vary considerably from curve to curve and from designer to designer. I like this algorithm because it doesn't require you to calculate the derivative of the weighting function, which makes it nice and easy to experiment with different weightings. For example, if you use the distance from the dolly to the player as a weight, it's nice and simple, and it gives you the classic drag or push the camera down the corridor shot. However, the angle from the tangent to the rail at the dolly, which is the weight we would have used for the tracking shot in the previous example, is a little bit more complex. And for certain special cases like bosses, we can use weights to deal with the boss obscuring the player. And probably the most complex weight we used is related to the number of minor characters that are out of frame and the amount they're out by. So, having calculated the position of our dolly, we combine it with the camera dynamics we described earlier. Only instead of calculating distance and angle from the position and orientation of the camera node in Maya, we actually derive them from the position and orientation of the dolly, where we will consider the tangent of the rail at the dolly to be the direction the dolly is pointing. In fact, you can consider the camera node to be a dolly on a zero-length rail. And that's the rail camera. With the system described so far, you can quite happily implement almost every camera in God of War. In fact, you can do it better because we didn't have ease in the first one. So now I'd like to talk about a system we added for God of War 2, field blending. Blending with timers is all well and good, but sometimes we wish we could control the progression of a blend from the position of the player. So that if they stopped halfway, the blend would stop too, rather than just charging on into the second camera. And if they reverse direction, the blend does too. Note the zone in the middle here references two cameras and has a direction. In fact, what we want to do is to be able to convert a position within a zone into a value, a field value. In this definition, a field is just a value that is determined from a position, like a magnetic field has a particular strength at a particular position in space. So as we cross this zone into the middle, we want the field value to be derived from the position within the zone, and then to turn that field value into a blend weight for the cameras in question. So the first thing we need to do is to turn the position within a zone into a field value that we can use to weight the blend. The direction of the field is defined by a vector associated with the zone. And because all our zones are convex, a line through the player, parallel to that vector, will intersect two planes of that zone. We calculate the distance from the player to the intersection point on each plane, and that's the equation under the diagram. At least I hope it is. The weight is the distance to the plane at the end of the vector over the sum of the distances, which gives us a field value of 0 to 1 across the zone. You might want to verify this bit, as I'm not sure if I have the plane equation the right way around here. So having calculated a field value, it gets returned as part of the query and copied into the entry in the submission list, and from there into any entries for that camera in the timer list. Well, the timer list is now no longer just contain timers. It now contains field values as well, control blending. So we're going to rename it the blend list. So now it contains a list of blending primitives. Should note here that the field-blended cameras only blend with other field-blended cameras. The group of field-blended cameras still have timers, but they're synchronized, so they'll all fade in together. If at any time all of the cameras in a field-blended group stop appearing in the query results, then we mark those primitives to stop updating their field values. This is so that if you re-enter a group before it's been faded out, then the old copy of the group doesn't suddenly pop to a new position. So let's have a look at that in an example. Here our field-blended camera zones are coloured blue. We start in Zone A. So Zone A is in the submission list. And we give it a nominal field value of 1, just to make the maths for blending a little simpler. Note that we've copied this value into the blend primitive. So now, as well as a camera reference and a timer, it also contains the field value. So we move into the field blended zone for B and C, and B and C appear at the top of the submission list. Note the red area indicating the currently active camera has grown. That's because, unlike before, where we only had one camera nominally active at any one time, we can now have many. Now, the active set of the blend list doesn't contain either B or C, so we start a pair of blend primitives with the same timer and copy their field values across. So, move into the field blended zone for C and D. C and D are now active in the submission list. B has dropped out. Its group is still active. So we'll remove it from the blend list as it effectively has a weight of 0. And start a new primitive for camera D and update their timers. At which rate we'll see that the timers have completed. So we'll remove the entries from below the group. Now we'll move out of the side of the CD zone into Zone E, which isn't field blended. So E becomes the active set in the submission list. And since it's not in the active set of the blend list, we insert it at the top. And since C and D have gone out of submission, we also freeze their field values in their blend primitives, so that if we re-enter their zone at a position other than halfway through the zone, this group won't suddenly pop. So let's have a look at an example blend list and see how we calculate the overall weights. First, we copy our field values into a set of weights and sum them within their groups so that we can then normalize them within the group. We then blend between the timers, and we treat the whole of a field blended group as one timer, so they all share the same timer. So there's the result of the blend, half of camera E and half of the field blend between cameras B, C and D. And fold that back into the individual weights. So now we have a list of weights for individual cameras. And we iterate along, blending in pairs as we did before. And we calculate each weight in the pair as a proportion of their sum and give the result, the sum, as its weight. We then blend this with the next entry in the blend list. Give it that weight. Until finally we blend with the last entry. And we can see that as a result of this, the proportions of each camera we use end up matching the normalized weights. So that's pretty much the same as for timed blends, except that we pre-calculate the weights rather than doing them on the fly, and calculate the blend factor from a pair of weights rather than from a single timer. Field blending turned out to be incredibly powerful. We used it a lot in God of War 2. It's a little bit more complex than normal, but it was well worth it. And that's the basics of the camera system. Did pretty much all of the game with these. So a few things I left out. Dealing with multiple targets, target definition and calculation, for example, how you turn any one character or position in the world, because we're not always just looking at the player into an individual into an actual target. For example, we'll do things like take a joint and we'll stick a damping sphere around it so that little movements in the joint won't end up making the camera sort of oscillate and vibrate while the player idles. Dealing with static and animated cameras, that arrangement of two angles and a distance from a position means that you can convert any camera into that form. So a static camera in Maya can be converted into the normal blend form and blended with other cameras, and the same with animated cameras. And indeed, animated cameras, because we take our orientation and position from the camera node in Maya, if we animate that, we can use that to drive the dynamic cameras as well, which provides for some interesting effects. The ability to override cameras at arbitrary points to focus on dynamic areas of interest, for example, during high-action combat sequences, which can occur anywhere in the game, not strictly controlled by a designer. We do things like we will freeze the camera in space and tilt it to look and frame completely the player. We can animate opposition in that action to look at, stuff like that. Framing fights using multiple targets, as I hinted at earlier, we can set our weighting system up to consider the positions of more than just the player and damping. So, for example, the rail system sometimes can get a little stuttery if your threshold was not tweaked particularly well, or if the rail is particularly convoluted or was not constructed particularly well. We can add a little bit of damping to the dolly, which removes a lot of the noise. Rotational blending. So when we blend between rotations, if you get two cameras that are nearly 180 degrees apart, then a small change in the orientation of one of them can cause a blend to flip between the two different paths around the circle. There's not actually a lot we can do about that. So what we do is indicate to the designer that a rotational blend is risky at this point, and let them fix it. That's actually kind of a general solution to a lot of problems, is to tell the designers that something's about to go wrong and that it's their problem to deal with it. It empowers them to take control of the game, because it really is their game. We're really just making tools for them to fulfill their vision, which, as a programmer who got into the business wanting to make games and in some ways design games, is a little disappointing, but I think that actually gives us the best results in the end. There was one more thing I want to talk about. We're currently in a bit of a transitional period. Some people have 4:3 displays. Other people have 16:9. I got my first widescreen 16:9 set in 1992, so this transitional period's been going on for quite a while, and I rather suspect it's going to be going on for quite a while as well. Now, for film, most people expect a 16:9 to display to show more image to the left and right than a 4:3 display, like the picture here, the little black bars indicating the extent of the 4:3 display. This is because movies are usually shot in a much wider aspect ratio than television. They started doing this before television, but it only became widely adopted after television was identified as a threat to Hollywood. If we did this with games, however, the extra information to the right and left would result in more vertices being processed, more objects on screen, more characters, more calculations, less culling, which basically means that our 16:9 version would run slower than our 4:3 one. So instead, what many games have been doing is to take the 4:3 version and to crop it at the top and bottom to produce a 16:9 version. This is what we did in the first God of War, and more recently, as did BioShock. And the trouble with this is that your 16:9 version is now showing less information than your 4:3 one was, which to my mind is slightly undesirable, and it doesn't go unnoticed these days. If you read forums or Kotaku, then you'll be aware of that. Boy, did I feel bad about that one. So what we did in God of War 2 was to compromise between the two. The 16:9 version shows a little bit more at the sides, and the 4:3 version shows a little bit more at the top and bottom. We end up showing a similar amount of vertices. Maybe the 16:9 one still shows a little bit more objects, but I think it's a reasonable compromise. In fact, in situations where it did have an effect, we ended up exposing it as a control to the designer to allow them to choose how a shot would be cropped. So here, they would have a control on the camera called the widescreen ratio, and if it's set to 1, then we show more at the sides. If it's set to 0, we crop the top and bottom. But most of the time it was defaulted to, and most of the time left at halfway in between. So, there we go. That's the basic rundown of the camera system for 2 God of Wars. I'd like to thank my cameramen, Jessica Brunel for the original God of War and Mark Simon for God of War 2. It really is their work primarily. I'd like to thank the rest of my code team, who are excellent. And I'd like to thank you for listening to me. So, any questions? Yes.
To film what's in front of the character, if they're traversing a long distance and you want to be able to see what's coming in front of you, How would you handle that with these systems?
So I think you're saying that how would we look ahead in front of the player as they're moving across a scene? Well, we actually use the cameras to indicate which direction the player should be moving at any one point. So at any one point in time, there is usually one obvious direction they should be going. So what we do is, if we want to be moving to the left, we'll set the safe zone off over to the right, which...
So it's a dynamic adjustment of the safe zone, basically?
Yeah, it's all done using the safe zone. The safe zone basically allows you to position the player on screen. So if they should be going up the stairs, then we'll position it so that the screen is showing mostly up the stairs.
Thank you.
So it's a very sophisticated, flexible camera system. How did your designers take to it? Did they need a lot of training? Did they pick it right up? I mean, what was your experience with that?
It worked out quite well, because what we did was we worked iteratively with them. I knocked up a very basic camera system, which was really just the zoning and the simple blending, and worked hand in hand with them to make sure that they picked it up. I mean, we're very hands-on with our designers. As I said, they're our customers. We're making tools for them. So that any time they can come up to us and talk to us. And yeah.
Good morning. I'd like to follow up on the issue of the relationship with the designers. And I was wondering if you could speculate sort of to the future as to the relationship between sort of automated camera control and the role of the designer. Where do you think this is going in terms of automation and the role of the designer?
I think they're going to take more and more control. In a game where in games like God of War, which are largely like scripted cinematic events, they're going to take more and more control of how the camera works.
They, the designers?
They being the designers, yes. I don't really see it as being the programmer's role to actually control and plan individual shots for the camera. We're providing tools for them to create the shots that they want.
How about in other genres, like, sandbox-type games or real-time strategy games and so on?
Well, almost entirely different, but I think you can actually still work those systems into an overall system like this. For example, if you replaced our dynamic system with a controllable follow cam or a player-controlled camera, then you could blend in and out of particular designer-controlled cameras back into the player-controlled camera. So I see this as being a system that you could adapt to those, but that's not what God of War was, so that's not what we did. We did have we have a follow camera, a user-controlled camera in the game for development purposes. That fits straight into the system. It's just not actually shipped with the game. Well, technically it is shipped with the game, and if you poked and hacked around in the executable enough, you could probably activate it.
Hi. I always tend to struggle with transitions from when I'm going onto a rail or coming off to a rail with a camera. I was just wondering if you had any tricks or any special blend techniques that you use for that.
I have to say that finding the initial position on the rail is one of the harder things to do. It's probably one of the bits of code that I've iterated on the most. And really all I ended up doing is just taking as many samples along the rail as I could and finding the one with the best weight, adding things like extra weights for how close you were to the camera you're just coming from. But yeah, it really is a case of playing with the weights and hoping it all works out. So many of my camera bugs were to do with transitioning onto a rail. It's one of the hard bits.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I was curious how you dealt with dealing with a complex weighting function blending between cameras versus just having the designer add another camera. How did you strike the balance between that for things such as like obstructions and stuff that might get in the way?
Well, we didn't. The only times we waited for obstruction was in the specific case of dealing with a boss character. I think Ares in the first one and the Barbarian King in the second one have what we do is we take both characters and we see how much they're overlapping from the perspective of the camera, and we use that as a weight So the rail, so in both cases, the camera was on a rail. In Ares, it was like a semicircle, and in the Barbarian King, it was a complete circle. So the camera would move to one side to try and minimize that weight. So the weight would actually be the amount of overlap. But when it comes to making those decisions, it was almost entirely down to the designers. Ares, I did hard code largely at the end. That's probably the single actual camera that I constructed in the game. In fact, there's only really 2 cameras in the game that I built by hand. The first one in Ares, and there's one on the outside of the Titan where you're shuffling along past a chain, and it takes a look down, and the camera shot animates dynamically. And I think those 2 are the only times I actually directly wrote a camera. So other than that, it's entirely up to the designers. They have all these tools available to them, so I let them make those decisions.
Thanks.
Were the fields built to make up for the limitations in the rail system? It sounded like that system was built later.
The field system, not really to compensate for the rail system. In fact, the fields and the rails together make up most of the cameras in God of War 2. No, the field system was built to remove the limitations of just using a timer. Because the problem would be you could creep between 2 zones, and suddenly the camera would start moving and then stop. And there would be no real relation between what the player had just done and what the camera did. So I decided to use a field system so that if the camera creeped through, so if the player creeped through one of these blended zones, the camera would creep with them.
Thanks.
Did you ever consider using quaternions rather than Euler angles?
The reason I use Eulers rather than quaternions is that when you tween quaternions, you can very easily end up introducing roll. And although roll is one of the things I allow the designers to control, it's generally not desirable in a transition between 2 cameras.
And a similar question for the rail, you chose a NURB. Why didn't you choose a Hermite curve for the rail as well?
Because Maya has lots of good tools for making NURBs, and NURBs are nice and powerful. And to be honest, once you've got the maths for dealing with NURBs down, you can do pretty much anything you can do in any other spline with a NURB.
Okay, thanks.
That's not to say you couldn't use like a Bezier or a Hermite or anything other than that. There's no real serious reason. I just prefer them because they're more flexible.
Hi. What kind of tool did you give the designers? Were they editing mostly just values, floats, and stuff like that, or did they have graphical tools to edit the camera?
In construction, they have they just have Maya, which we've made a few extensions to, but mostly in terms of adding attributes and giving them scripts to make things easier to construct. At runtime, there's all sorts of visualizations. They can see the submission and the blend lists. They can see the safe zone and the positions of all the targets. They can tweak all of the extended attributes of the camera dynamically. Yeah.
Thank you.
Else?
If you had to do again, would you use for fields instead of having several separate cameras? Would you consider using a system where the designer lays down a NURBS curve in the world, and as they traverse along one shot connect, just parameterized based on the location of that NURB and use that as your best?
So what you're saying is taking the nearest point on the NURB and using that as a parameter to drive. Right. So instead of doing that through a field, I did. I was told about this. Apparently, this is what Naughty Dog do for a lot of their games. I didn't really think about it seriously. It wouldn't be too difficult to add into this system. There's no real reason for going one against the other. I think probably my troubles with finding best points on rails discouraged me from using them too freely. Plus, I think the zones are also easier to visualize because all the cameras are already zoned. Okay? Anyone else? I'm getting a wind-up message anyway, so... Right, thank you very much.